The most dangerous secrets are not the ones people hide from strangers. They are the ones families hide from themselves. 15 years after my father passed away, I thought there was nothing left to discover about him. His photograph still sat above the fireplace in my mother's living room. His favorite coffee mug still occupied the same cabinet shelf. His old leather jacket still hung in the hallway closet because my mother, Margaret Bennett, could never bring herself to move it. We remembered him every year. We told the same stories. We laughed at the same memories. We believed we knew the truth about the man he had been. Looking back now, I realize we only knew the version of him that fit comfortably into our lives. The day everything changed began with a family gathering. My name is Sarah Bennett. I was 43 years old, and our family had come together to mark the 15th anniversary of my father's passing. My mother was 72. Time had softened some of her grief, but not all of it. Certain dates still carried weight. This was one of them. The afternoon started quietly. Relatives filled the house with conversation. My younger brother Daniel helped set out food in the kitchen. Cousins gathered in the backyard. My mother moved between rooms, greeting everyone with her usual warm smile. On the surface, it felt like every other family gathering we had held for years. Yet something felt different. Perhaps it was because the house seemed older than I remembered. Or perhaps it was because I found myself noticing details I had ignored before. At one point, my mother asked if someone could bring down several folding chairs stored in the attic. I volunteered immediately. The attic had always been my father's domain. Growing up, we rarely went up there. He kept old tools, family records, holiday decorations, and boxes nobody ever seemed to touch. A narrow staircase led upward from the hallway. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight as I climbed. The air smelled faintly of old wood and cardboard. I located the chairs quickly, but before carrying them downstairs, something caught my attention. In the far corner of the attic sat a large wooden trunk. I did not recognize. It looked older than everything around it. The brass latch showed signs of age. A thin layer of dust covered the surface. Curious, I stepped closer. Attached to the handle was a small tag written in my father's handwriting. I froze immediately. I would have recognized that handwriting anywhere, even after 15 years. The tag contained only 4 words. Not for storage. Important. A strange feeling settled over me. My father had labeled everything, yet none of us had ever mentioned this trunk. I knelt beside it and carefully brushed away the dust. The latch was not locked. For several seconds, I simply stared. Part of me felt as though I should walk away. Another part wanted answers. Eventually, curiosity won. I opened the trunk slowly. Inside were several neatly stacked boxes, old photographs, folders, and personal belongings. Then I saw it. Resting beneath everything else was a thick black journal. The cover showed signs of years of use. A faded elastic band wrapped around it. My heart began beating faster. I carefully lifted it into my hands. On the first page, written in unmistakable blue ink, were words that immediately made my stomach tighten. If my family is reading this, then there are things I never found the courage to say while I was alive. I stared at the page in complete silence. Downstairs, I could still hear relatives talking and laughing. But in that moment, it felt as though the entire world had gone quiet. Because deep inside, I knew that whatever waited inside those pages was about to change everything. For several moments, I remained kneeling beside the trunk with the journal resting in my hands. My father's handwriting stared back at me from the page. It felt impossible and familiar at the same time. 15 years had passed since his funeral, yet suddenly it felt as though he were standing beside me again. Downstairs, I could hear dishes clinking and relatives talking. Life continued as normal for everyone else. But for me, the world had shifted. I carefully carried the journal downstairs along with the folding chairs. At first, I considered keeping what I had found to myself. Maybe I should read it alone. Maybe I should wait until everyone left. Yet something about those opening words convinced me otherwise. If my father had wanted secrecy, he would never have written that first sentence. When I entered the living room carrying the journal, my mother immediately noticed it. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Where did you find that?" she asked. The room grew quieter. "In a trunk in the attic," I replied. "I have never seen it before." My brother Daniel looked surprised. "Dad had a journal?" I shook my head. "Not that I knew about." My mother stared at the cover for several seconds. Her expression was difficult to read. There was recognition there, but also uncertainty. "I remember that notebook," she said quietly. Your father wrote in it late at night sometimes. Did you ever read it? Daniel asked. She slowly shook her head. No, he kept it private. A strange silence settled over the room. Several relatives moved closer. Even cousins who had been chatting in the kitchen wandered in to see what was happening. The journal sat on the coffee table like an unopened letter from another world. Finally, Daniel spoke. Read it. I looked at my mother. Are you sure? She hesitated before nodding. If he wanted us to find it, then yes. My hands felt unsteady as I opened the journal again. The first pages contained ordinary observations. Notes about work. Thoughts about weather. Small details from daily life. Everyone relaxed slightly. The tension seemed unnecessary. Then I turned another page. Everything changed. The entry was dated almost 17 years earlier. My father had written about a family gathering remarkably similar to the one we were having now. I began reading aloud. Sometimes people sit around the same table and believe they understand each other. The truth is often very different. The room became quiet again. I continued. There are things happening in this family that nobody sees except me. I stopped reading for a moment. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? I shrugged. I do not know yet. My mother remained completely silent. I turned to the next paragraph. One day my children may believe stories that are not true. If that happens, I hope these pages help them understand what really happened. A chill ran through me. The words felt intentional, directed toward us. Not random reflections. A message. Keep going, someone whispered from across the room. I continued reading. My father's words described tensions within the family. Misunderstandings. Assumptions. Quiet judgments. Nothing dramatic. Yet there was an unmistakable theme running through every sentence. He believed people were seeing only part of the truth. I worry most about Margaret, I read aloud. My mother's head lifted immediately. The room seemed to stop breathing. She carries burdens nobody notices. One day, I fear she will be judged by people who never understood what she sacrificed. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. I looked at my mother. Her eyes remained fixed on the journal. For the first time that afternoon, I saw emotion breaking through her calm expression. Whatever was hidden inside those pages, it was not simply my father's diary. It was becoming something far more powerful. It was his final attempt to tell a story that had never been told. No one asked me to stop reading. In fact, the longer I sat there with the journal open in my hands, the more it felt as though everyone in the room was afraid of missing a single word. My father had been gone for 15 years, yet somehow his voice was becoming the strongest presence in the house. I turned the page carefully. The next entry had been written only a few months after the one I had just read. The handwriting looked slightly rushed, as though he had been eager to record his thoughts before they disappeared. Today I watched Margaret do something extraordinary, I read aloud. My mother lowered her eyes. Nobody noticed. Nobody thanked her. Nobody even knew it happened. But I saw it. The room remained silent. I continued reading. My father described an ordinary winter afternoon. A relative had experienced financial difficulties and needed help paying several urgent bills. The family never learned where the assistance came from. According to the journal, my mother quietly used money she had been saving for something she wanted herself. She never told anyone. She never expected recognition. She simply helped and moved on. I stopped reading and looked up. Several relatives appeared confused. One of my cousins finally spoke. I never knew that. My mother offered a small shrug. There was no reason for anyone to know. I looked back down at the page. My father's words continued. The strange thing about sacrifice is that it often becomes invisible. The people making the sacrifice rarely announce it. The people benefiting from it rarely recognize it. The sentence lingered in the room long after I finished reading it. I turned another page, then another. With each entry, a pattern began to emerge. My father was not writing about dramatic events. He was documenting quiet moments, small decisions, acts of generosity, things most people would overlook. Yet together they painted a picture none of us had ever seen. Margaret carries more responsibility than anyone realizes. I read. Sometimes I think the family assumes she is strong because she never complains. They do not understand that strength often hides exhaustion. I felt my throat tighten. Growing up, I had always viewed my mother as capable, reliable, steady. It never occurred to me that those qualities came with a cost. The journal continued. If my children ever read this, I hope they understand something. Their mother spent years protecting them from worries they never knew existed. Daniel leaned forward. What worries? I asked the same question silently in my mind. We soon received an answer. Several pages later, my father described periods when money had been tight, business setbacks, unexpected expenses, medical bills, challenges that threatened the family's stability. According to the journal, my mother had quietly managed those burdens behind the scenes. She adjusted budgets, took extra shifts at work, delayed purchases she wanted, made sacrifices without discussing them. My brother stared at the floor. I could tell he was remembering the same childhood I was. We never felt deprived. We never felt insecure. Apparently, that had not happened by accident. She made it look easy, my father wrote. That was her gift, and perhaps her curse. When people do difficult things gracefully, others forget those things are difficult. Nobody spoke after I finished that sentence. My mother sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked uncomfortable with the attention. Yet she never denied anything I read. As I turned another page, I noticed the date written at the top. The entry had been recorded only 3 years before my father's death. The handwriting appeared more deliberate than before, more personal, more urgent, and the very first line made my heart skip a beat. There is one misunderstanding in this family that worries me more than any other. If I do not correct it now, the people I love may spend years believing something that is not true. The room seemed smaller after I read that sentence. Every relative sitting in the living room leaned forward slightly, waiting for the explanation my father had promised. Even my mother looked unsettled. For the first time all afternoon, she appeared nervous about what might come next. I swallowed hard and continued reading. The misunderstanding is not about money. It is not about success. It is not about mistakes. It is about Margaret. The silence deepened. My father's words felt less like journal entries and more like a conversation he had been unable to finish before his death. Over the years, I have watched people make assumptions about my wife. Some believe she is distant. Some believe she favors responsibility over affection. Some believe she cares more about solving problems than expressing love. They are wrong. I paused briefly. My mother closed her eyes. Across the room, Daniel exchanged a glance with me. We had both heard versions of those assumptions before. Friends and relatives often described our mother as practical, reliable, strong. Rarely had anyone called her emotional. My father continued. Margaret loves deeply. She simply loves through actions rather than words. Unfortunately, actions are often easier to overlook. I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. The more I read, the more I realized how often I had misunderstood her myself. Growing up, I always knew my mother cared about us. Yet I had sometimes wished she were more expressive, more open, more like other mothers I knew. According to my father, she had been carrying burdens none of us understood. Several years ago, I read aloud. Sarah became convinced that her mother disapproved of many of her choices. They never discussed it directly. Both continued moving forward while quietly believing things that were not true. My heart nearly stopped. The room blurred around me. My father was talking about me. I remembered those years immediately. After college, I chose a career path my mother did not seem excited about. She never criticized me. She never argued. Yet her silence felt like disappointment. At least that was what I believed. The truth, my father wrote, is that Margaret spent countless nights worrying about Sarah's future because she cared so much. Concern was mistaken for judgment. Love was mistaken for distance. Tears began forming in my eyes. I looked toward my mother. She was staring at the floor. Mom, I whispered. She slowly nodded. Your father is right. The admission felt almost shocking. We had never talked about it. Not once. I was proud of you, she said quietly. I just worried all the time. The room remained silent as decades of misunderstanding began unraveling. I returned to the journal. The next several pages contained similar observations. My father described misunderstandings involving cousins, siblings, and relatives. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. People interpreted my mother's quiet strength as emotional distance. They mistook sacrifice for obligation. They confused responsibility with indifference. One day, my father wrote, I hope they realize that some of the most loving people in the world are not the loudest. They are the people who quietly show up every single day. By now, several relatives were wiping their eyes. Even those who rarely displayed emotion seemed affected. Then I reached the final paragraph of the entry. The handwriting appeared darker, as though my father had pressed harder against the paper while writing. There is one sacrifice Margaret made that nobody knows about. Not even our children. I promised I would keep her confidence while I was alive. But after I am gone, they deserve the truth. My hands froze. My heart began pounding. The room became completely silent once again. Whatever came next was clearly the secret my father had been building toward all along. For several seconds, I could not bring myself to turn the page. The entire room sat frozen in anticipation. Every face was turned toward the journal. Every person seemed to understand that we were standing at the edge of something important. My mother looked pale. Not frightened exactly. More like someone who had spent years carrying a memory she never expected to revisit. Finally, I gathered my courage and continued reading. The sacrifice happened 12 years ago, my father wrote. At the time, neither Sarah nor Daniel knew how serious the situation had become. I chose not to tell them because I wanted them focused on building their futures. Margaret agreed. Looking back, I am not sure we made the right decision. I paused. 12 years ago. That would have placed me in my early 30s and Daniel in his late 20s. I remembered those years well. They seemed ordinary from my perspective. Apparently, they had not been ordinary at all. The business was struggling, my father continued. Several contracts disappeared unexpectedly. Medical expenses arrived at the same time. We faced choices I never imagined making. The room remained silent. I looked toward my mother. She stared at the journal without speaking. There was a moment when we came dangerously close to losing the house. I read aloud. A collective gasp moved through the room. Daniel immediately shook his head. That cannot be right. I felt the same disbelief. We had never known. Not once had either of our parents mentioned financial trouble. Family gatherings continued. Holidays continued. Life appeared normal. According to the journal, it was anything but normal. I spent months searching for solutions, my father wrote. I worked longer hours. I borrowed against future income. Nothing was enough. Eventually, I accepted that we would have to sell the property unless something changed. I turned the page. My father's handwriting grew noticeably heavier. What happened next still humbles me. My heart began racing. Without telling anyone, Margaret sold something she had treasured since before we were married. I stopped reading and looked at my mother. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. For the first time all afternoon, she looked away. Mom, Daniel whispered. She remained silent. I continued. She sold the inheritance her grandmother left her. Jewelry passed through 3 generations of women. Pieces she loved. Pieces she planned to pass down one day. The room became completely still. I remembered those items. Not clearly, just fragments. A velvet box. A necklace. Several pieces my mother occasionally wore during special occasions when we were children. Then one day they were gone. I never questioned it. Margaret told everyone she had placed the jewelry in storage. My father wrote. The truth is that she sold every piece to keep this family secure. Tears rolled down my mother's cheeks. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed capable of speaking. She never wanted recognition. The journal continued. She insisted the children never learn about it. She believed protecting their future mattered more than preserving her own memories. I felt tears forming in my own eyes. Suddenly dozens of childhood memories looked different. The vacations that continued. The home we kept. The stability we enjoyed. None of it happened by accident. I have spent years watching people misunderstand Margaret, my father wrote. Some see only a practical woman. They never see what that practicality cost her. Across the room, several relatives were openly crying. Even Daniel had lowered his head. Then I reached the final paragraph on the page. If my family is reading this now, I hope they understand something important. The greatest acts of love are rarely the most visible. The greatest acts of love are often the sacrifices nobody ever hears about. As I finished reading, I realized that the story we thought we knew about our family was slowly disappearing. In its place, a very different truth was beginning to emerge. After I finished reading, nobody spoke for a very long time. The silence felt different now. Earlier, people had been curious. Now they were confronting something much heavier. Regret. My mother sat quietly in her chair with tears resting on her cheeks. She made no effort to wipe them away. For years, she had protected a secret that was finally standing in the center of the room for everyone to see. Daniel broke the silence first. Why did you never tell us? He asked softly. My mother looked at him with a sad smile. Because your father and I agreed that you deserved a childhood free from those worries. Daniel lowered his eyes. But we should have known. No, She replied gently. You should have been young. That was more important. Her answer only made the room more emotional. I looked back at the journal resting in my lap. The pages suddenly felt heavier than before. They were no longer revealing isolated memories. They were exposing an entirely different version of our family history, one built on sacrifices nobody had understood. I turned the page and continued reading. The entry that followed had been written almost a year later. My father's handwriting appeared steadier, more reflective. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming they understand someone simply because they have known them for a long time. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. My father continued, I have watched family members create stories about one another. Most of those stories are incomplete. Some are completely wrong. I could almost hear his voice as I read. Margaret has become the victim of many assumptions. Not because people are cruel, because assumptions are easier than conversations. The sentence hit me hard. Looking back, I realized how often I had assumed things instead of asking questions. I assumed my mother was disappointed in me. I assumed she approved of Daniel more than me. I assumed her silence meant criticism. The journal was slowly proving that many of those assumptions had never been true. The saddest part, my father wrote, is that people often spend years reacting to things that only exist in their imagination. The room remained completely silent. Then I reached another passage that immediately caught my attention. Several members of this family still believe Margaret encouraged me to work too much during my final years. That belief could not be further from the truth. My hands froze. I remembered hearing comments like that after my father's death. Relatives often suggested he had carried too many responsibilities. Some quietly implied that my mother had expected too much from him. Apparently, my father knew those conversations had happened. If anyone deserves blame, he wrote, it is me. Margaret spent years asking me to slow down. She encouraged me to rest. She encouraged me to spend more time with family. I rarely listened. My mother lowered her head. I told him that every week, she whispered. The sadness in her voice felt genuine and old. Not fresh grief. The kind of grief that settles into a person's life and stays there. She protected me from stress whenever possible, my father continued. She carried burdens I never fully appreciated while I was alive. Tears filled my eyes again. The journal was accomplishing something remarkable. Every page dismantled another misunderstanding. Every entry revealed a truth hidden beneath years of assumptions. Then I reached the final paragraph on the page. The handwriting became noticeably slower, more deliberate. There is one final misunderstanding that has haunted me for years. It concerns something that happened shortly before my illness. If my family is reading this now, they deserve to know exactly what happened. My heart immediately began racing. Around me, relatives leaned forward once again. We all sensed the same thing. Whatever truth my father had been building toward was finally approaching. My hands felt unusually cold as I turned the page. The entire room had fallen silent again. Nobody reached for food. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody moved. 15 years after my father's death, he somehow held everyone's attention more completely than when he was alive. I took a slow breath and continued reading. This may be the hardest thing I have ever written, my father began, because it concerns a misunderstanding that has shaped relationships inside this family for years. I immediately felt tension build inside the room. Several relatives exchanged nervous glances. Even my mother looked apprehensive. Many people believe Margaret and I disagreed about the future of this family during my illness, the journal continued. Some believe she influenced important decisions. Others believe she pushed me toward choices that were entirely my own. I paused. I remembered hearing fragments of those conversations after my father passed away. Not direct accusations, just whispers, suggestions, assumptions. My father seemed determined to address them once and for all. The truth is simple, I read aloud. Every major decision during that period was mine. Margaret did not pressure me. She did not manipulate me. In fact, she often argued for the opposite of what I wanted. My mother quietly covered her mouth. Tears continued slipping down her cheeks. The room remained motionless. As my health declined, I became increasingly concerned about what would happen to the family after I was gone, my father wrote. I wanted plans in place. I wanted security. I wanted certainty. Margaret wanted something else. She wanted more time together. The words landed heavily. I continued reading. I spent months organizing documents, preparing records, and making practical arrangements. Margaret repeatedly reminded me that my presence mattered more than my paperwork. She was right. I wish I had listened more carefully. Nobody spoke. The honesty in those words felt almost painful. Then I reached another paragraph. There is one conversation I have never forgotten. Sarah and Daniel will remember it differently because they only witnessed part of it. My heart immediately began racing. Daniel sat up straighter beside me. Several weeks before a family gathering, Margaret encouraged me to cancel a series of obligations and spend more time at home. I refused. An argument followed. I remembered that day. I had been in the next room. I remembered raised voices. I remembered believing my mother was criticizing my father. Apparently, I had been wrong. For years, some people assumed Margaret was upset about finances or responsibilities. The truth is that she was afraid. She saw changes in my health before I was willing to acknowledge them. The room became completely still. She was trying to protect me. I mistook her concern for interference. It remains one of my greatest regrets. I stopped reading for a moment. My eyes filled with tears. My father was not only correcting our misunderstandings, he was correcting his own. If anyone ever questions Margaret's intentions, the journal continued, they should know this. No person has ever fought harder for my well-being than my wife. My mother lowered her head. Daniel wiped his eyes. Several relatives looked visibly emotional. Then I turned to what appeared to be the final section of the entry. The handwriting grew slower, more deliberate, almost as though my father understood the importance of every word. There is one final message I need my family to hear, he wrote. Not about mistakes, not about sacrifice, not about regret, about gratitude. My heartbeat quickened immediately. Somehow I knew we were approaching the pages he had intended us to remember most. The pages he had preserved for 15 years without knowing whether anyone would ever read them. The pages that might finally explain why he had hidden this journal in the attic all those years ago. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the next page. The room was so quiet that I could hear the old clock ticking in the hallway. Every person present seemed to understand that we had reached the most important part of my father's journal. For 15 years, these words had waited in silence. Now they finally had an audience. I took a slow breath and continued reading. If you have reached this part of the journal, my father wrote, then you have already learned many things about Margaret that I wish everyone had understood while I was alive. But there is one final truth that matters more than all the others. I felt my chest tighten. People often measure a life by accomplishments, careers, income, achievements. I have learned that those things are temporary. What truly matters is who stands beside you when life becomes difficult. Several relatives lowered their eyes. Nobody interrupted. When I look back on my life, the journal continued. The greatest blessing I ever received was not success. It was Margaret. Tears immediately filled my mother's eyes. Daniel quietly wiped his face. I could barely continue reading through my own emotions. She stood beside me during every setback, every disappointment, every fear. She celebrated my victories and carried my burdens. More importantly, she helped me become a better husband, father, and human being than I could have been alone. The room remained completely silent. If my children remember nothing else from these pages, I hope they remember this. Your mother did not simply support this family. She held it together in ways most of you will never fully understand. I looked up briefly. Every face in the room had changed. The assumptions, the judgments, the old stories, they seemed to be disappearing one by one. My father's words continued. Sarah, if you are reading this, I want you to know something. I was always proud of you, even during the moments when I failed to say it clearly. Your determination reminded me of your mother. You inherited more from her than you realize. My vision blurred. For a moment I could not speak. Hearing those words after so many years felt overwhelming. I gathered myself and continued. Daniel, I hope you understand that kindness is one of your greatest strengths. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Your mother taught both of us that lesson every day. Daniel lowered his head and quietly nodded. Then I reached a section addressed to the entire family. There will come a day when I am gone and the people I love are forced to continue without me. When that day comes, I hope they choose understanding over assumptions, conversations over silence, appreciation over judgment. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed capable of moving. Too many families spend years carrying misunderstandings that could be resolved with a single honest conversation. Do not make that mistake. Life is shorter than you think. The words hung in the air long after I finished reading them. Then I turned to the final page of the message. The handwriting appeared slower than anywhere else in the journal, almost as though my father had chosen each word carefully. If this journal accomplishes anything, I hope it helps my family see one another more clearly, not as they imagine each other to be, not through old assumptions, but as they truly are. I swallowed hard and read the final lines aloud. And if Margaret is sitting in the room while these words are being read, then let me say what I should have said more often. Thank you for everything. The moment I finished reading, nobody spoke. The silence that followed was unlike any silence that had come before. It was not confusion. It was not shock. It was the silence of people finally seeing the truth. For a long moment after the final words left my mouth, nobody spoke. The journal remained open in my hands, but its purpose had already been fulfilled. My father's voice had crossed 15 years of silence and reached every person in the room. I looked around and saw something I had never expected to see. Not shock, not disbelief. Understanding. Real understanding. My mother sat quietly with tears in her eyes, but there was a different expression on her face now. Relief. The kind of relief that comes when a burden carried for decades is finally set down. Daniel was the first to move. He stood from his chair and walked across the room. Without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around our mother. She closed her eyes and held him tightly. Several relatives wiped away tears. Others stared at the floor as if reconsidering years of assumptions. The atmosphere inside the house felt completely different from the one that had existed only hours earlier. Eventually, Daniel stepped back and smiled through his tears. "I wish we had known," he said softly. My mother nodded. "Your father and I thought we were protecting you." "You did," he replied. "You protected all of us." The words seemed to unlock something inside the room. One by one, family members began sharing memories. Small moments they had forgotten. Acts of kindness they had overlooked. Sacrifices they only understood now because of what the journal had revealed. Every story seemed to point toward the same truth. My mother had spent her life giving more than anyone realized. Yet she never asked for recognition. She never demanded appreciation. She simply kept showing up. As the conversations continued, I glanced back at the journal. The black cover looked ordinary. There was nothing remarkable about it. No one would ever have guessed that such a simple object could change an entire family. Yet that was exactly what had happened. My father had not left us money. He had not left instructions. He had left perspective. He had given us the opportunity to see each other more clearly than we ever had before. Later that evening, after many relatives had gone home, only a few of us remained in the living room. The house felt peaceful. The tension that had existed earlier was gone. My mother sat beside me on the couch. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she gently touched the journal resting on the coffee table. "Your father always hoped you would find it one day," she said. I looked at her in surprise. "You knew?" She nodded slowly. "Not where he hid it, but I knew he was writing it." "Why did he never tell us?" I asked. A small smile appeared on her face. "Because he believed some truths need time before people are ready to hear them." I thought about that for a long moment. Then I looked around the room. At the family photographs. At the empty chair my father used to sit in. At the people who remained. For years, I believed losing my father meant his story had ended. I understood now how wrong I had been. His story had continued through every lesson he left behind. Through every sacrifice we finally understood. Through every misunderstanding that had finally been corrected. As the evening came to an end, I carefully closed the journal and held it against my chest. 15 years earlier, my father had written those pages hoping his family would one day discover the truth. That day had finally arrived, and as I looked at my mother smiling quietly beside me, I realized the greatest gift he left behind was not the journal itself. It was the chance for all of us to become a family that truly understood one another before it was too late.